Being a wrestling fan all your life means that you go through copious amounts of pain. I mean, if you were actually to sit down and think of the emotional roller coaster that professional wrestling put us through from the time we first watched it up until present day, man, it can get kind of depressing. In this video, we're going to dig way back and dig up some of those old wounds and memories. These are the wrestling moments that straight up ruined my childhood. Before we get started, just wanted to mention the like button's right down there. There's also a subscribe button. Hey, you know what I'm talking about. First one up, the Black Scorpion. Now, geez, the Black Scorpion, for those of you aren't inclined, was a mysterious entity that began haunting my favorite wrestler at the time, Sting. These super spooky messages would appear on WCW TV where it was literally just a black figure against a blue background, and it was a very menacing voice that would say, "Sting, I have a present for you, Sting." Enough to completely freak out my 5-year-old mind. Many memories of being terrorized by my older brothers with that voice. Just be sitting down for dinner one night, "Sting, Brendan, present for you, Brendan." The mysterious character was eventually revealed to be Ric Flair, although that wasn't the initial plan. I guess Ole Anderson thought that he was going to get Ultimate Warrior to jump ship from WWF, so that was the initial plan, but it ended up being Ric Flair, and it was all kind of lame when it all played out. Something that's well covered in the wrestle crap annals of time. Also, fun trivia fact that the disembodied voice itself belonged to none other than Ole Anderson, so I have him to thank for my nightmares. Thank you, Ole. Let's talk about the Ultimate Warrior getting cursed. This happened, and I want to say like 1992, 93 sometime, so I was probably like 7 or 8 years old. A fresh new superstar known as Papa Shango was on the scene, and apparently Papa Shango was some sort of voodoo priest. That fact was pretty much completely lost on me as a 7-year-old. I just thought he was some kind of spooky Halloween guy that casted spells on people. You know, I don't know. I didn't know much about the subject at the time. I was 7. He starts feuding with the Ultimate Warrior. They have him do all this weird stuff, like he casts a spell on him, and on one show he was like rendered all unconscious and ended up throwing up all over the place. It was probably the most disgusting thing I had ever seen on wrestling TV at that time. There was also another time where he made blood run from his forehead, which was super creepy. Now, there's always been scary stuff in wrestling, but this kind of effects is something that Vince McMahon took to a whole new level and took it just a step above and beyond the envelope that he was pushing with my next subject, which would be The Undertaker in general. Undertaker debuted at the 1990 Survivor Series, and gotta be honest, even though I was 5 years old at that time, the debut itself didn't do a whole lot to incite fear into my 5-year-old brain. Imagine that, right? But it was more or less the stuff that they ended up doing with Taker later on. A lot of the vignettes, a lot of the things with the coffins and the making of the coffins, and then once they started really emphasizing the fact that he could roll his eyes back into his head and stuff like that. Definitely pretty creepy. You know, they had the funeral parlor show with him and Paul Bearer as well. Once they introduced that element into the character, that was also scary. I mean, just this big portly guy with this like pale face that like it didn't even look like his face was attached. It looked like it was like a complete weird like mask thing. And then, you know, he started wanting to bury people, like bury Hulkamania and bury Kamala and all these different guys, you know, bury Jimmy Snuka. And the promos and the vignettes were a whole other level. I mean, imagine watching an innocent wrestling tape at like midnight when you're like 7 years old and you're just watching that day's show, and then all of a sudden that Undertaker promo comes across the screen and he's all creepy and there's no one else up in the house. Anyone else experience that, or was it just me? Norman the Lunatic. You know, I don't have a whole lot of memories about this, but I do know that at first when he came out as like a heel, he was pretty scary. But I do remember that the heel persona only lasted so long, and then they flipped him into like this weird, goofy babyface mental patient, which just wasn't quite as effective. But the original Norman the Lunatic definitely freaked me out. 502, don't be blue. Speaking of childhood terror, next one on my list is Cala. I mean, just take a look at Cala. What kid wouldn't be freaked out by Cala? I mean, come on. The guy didn't even have to say anything, just had to exist. And it's super weird watching shoot interviews of him later in life, and he seems just like the nicest guy in the world, but literally everyone was straight up terrified of him, or at least if you were my age when he was coming about, you definitely were. And this is another terror story as well. If my older brothers wanted me out of the room, all they would have to say is, "Here comes Cala with a mouse." I would leave the room screaming. That's how much Cala scared me as a child, and was partially responsible for ruining my childhood. Any bald midget wrestler anywhere, okay? And it's not even their fault. I'm sorry, little person, whatever we're calling them nowadays, dwarves. For whatever reason, I had a recurring dream when I was younger. And this dream was more like a nightmare, and it involved being ganged up on by a group of bald midgets, a whole swarm of them. They would just haunt me in my dreams. So I don't know anyone specifically, but if I saw a bald midget wrestler when I was a kid, definitely a good chance it had something to do with ruining my childhood. Ah yes, Demolition. Well, the famous story about Demolition is, of course, their face paint freaked me out when I was like young. I mean, we're talking, I did eventually grow out of this pretty quickly when I was like 3, 4, maybe even like 5 years old, completely freaked out over Demolition. One of my earliest memories is being 3 years old. WWF was coming to our state, and they were doing one show that was about 20 miles from us, and then another show that was about 60 miles from us. My family went to both shows. I elected not to go to the 60-mile one because, yes, indeed, Demolition was going to be present at the show, and I was scared to death of them. What I wouldn't have given to have that choice and that decision back just a matter of years later. So I think at this point in the list, I could pretty much safe to say that anyone with face paint, anybody with a mask, I mean, you can go up and down the list. Doom, you know, pretty much anyone with a mask. Now, those just like those regular, like generic wrestler masks didn't really scare me a whole lot. But if it was anything sort of intricate, you know, Big Van Vader, even for a minute there with that, when he had the huge helmet that would spew the smoke or whatever, that freaked me out. Pretty much mask or face paint, any of that stuff, I was out. Also, while we're on the subject and I'm bringing up these old wounds, here's something I want to throw out there in this video as well. Let me know if your experience was similar to this or not. But what I want to know is, looking back on being a young wrestling fan, we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7 years old or whatever. I had older brothers and a dad that would watch it with me. How come at no point in time no one ever thought to try to mention or hint to me to the fact that all this was a work? All right? It's weird because I've watched wrestling with my kids pretty much from the day that they were born. They were raised around. And I've never been able to lie to them to the point to stretch that it's much of a work. In fact, I remind them of that several times throughout the years, throughout the same show even have to remind them that it is a work. And what's weird is, even though I've told them that, I still don't think the youngest ones really believe. But when you think back on it though, wouldn't you have wanted to hear that from whoever you were watching it with, your friend or your family member that was exposing you to this, or someone I know some people discovered it just on their own, surfing the channels, which is also cool. But you know what I mean? Why didn't anyone mention to me, hey man, don't be so scared. This is basically just like a movie playing out in front of you. None of my family mentioned it to me. You know what I got? I got to live till I was like, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 years old. Maybe it was a little earlier, but at some point in time, it was either a neighbor or a kid at school that said, hey, that stuff is fake. At which at that point, you don't understand at all how it possibly could be. And so you end up defending it to the death and either getting picked on more or it escalating into some kind of physical altercation or some kind of continuing situation. Which brings me to how I'm going to end this video here in general, guys, is that the biggest thing about wrestling that could have ruined my childhood is just that fact, the day that we found out that it was a work. And like I said, at first someone mentions something, you defend it to the death, you start thinking about how it could be true or untrue. Eventually you find yourself at a point to where you pretty much confirm your suspicions, and you either love it enough to keep watching and appreciate it for what it is, or some people just end up completely casting it to the wayside. For me, it just made me even more intrigued about this art form and want to learn so much more about it. I think it also really helped that by the time I realized that kayfabe was a thing, I was probably, or at least until I fully accepted it, I was probably somewhere around 10, 11 years old when I was starting to actually grasp that concept. And right as I was grasping that concept, here came the NWO. Here came the Attitude Era, a lot of things which, if nothing else, made you question everything that you thought you knew about wrestling. It was a completely different time, arguably the greatest time. You lived through it. Today is cool, but to be a fan in 1998, completely whole different level. And I'm talking about if you were a real fan, not just one of these Johnny-come-latelys that was watching it just because it was popular at the time, okay? People like myself, and probably yourself if you're watching this here right now, we've all latched on to something at some point in time, and some of us are never letting go. That's probably me. Anyway, guys, this was really, really fun. I don't know, just a cool little video idea I had. I want something very important from you as we wrap up here, though, okay? I want you to leave me down in the comments moments, people, wrestlers, whatever it is, things that ruined your childhood. So things that if you lived through a different era, you probably have a lot different experiences than I did growing up, of course. Could imagine being a child and trying to wrap my head around the Katie Vick angle or something like that. So this will be interesting. I want to hear from you guys, so please sound down in the comments about that. That's all I got for now, guys. On your way out, make sure to leave a like. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, we'll see you right here on Pro Wrestling Planet.